In this video, we're going to be talking more in depth of field. So what is your depth of field? Your depth of field is what is the amount of detail that shows up in your pictures. For some pictures, there's a lot of detail, like your landscapes, and for others, there's a lot less detail, like your portraits, the backgrounds in your portraits. Okay? How does that work with your camera? Your camera controls that specifically with your f-stop, also known as your aperture. Okay? The camera mode is, we're going to refer to it as aperture, while the camera setting is going to call it your f-stop. So they are one and the same, but just keep that in mind as you're going through camera settings. Okay? Now, to get the pictures, your portraits with blurry backgrounds, is the aperture in your lens is wide open. Okay? It allows the most light to come through the lens, but with all of that light, it's really hard for the camera to capture all that detail that's coming through. Okay? However, to get pictures like landscapes that have a lot of detail, the aperture is going to narrow down so less light comes through and giving it a chance to get all the detail that's there without being bombarded by all this light. So the concept is a lot like the pupils in our eyes, because when we step outside, our pupils contract to get really small so that we can take in all the light but still see. Okay? But when it's really dark, our eyes will dilate, the pupils get really big, trying to allow in as much and any light possible so that we can see things around us. So when you go to the eye doctor, they dilate your eyes, they tell you to put on those sunglasses, because going outside with your eyes, your pupils wide open like that could damage it. Okay? So as we look at the camera, it's the same concept. Okay? The wider the aperture, the more light that comes through, the more that you'll be able to see in low light situations. Okay? The narrower your aperture, the more detail you're going to see, but a lot less light is going to come through. Imagine if your eyes, your pupils stayed really small and dark. You wouldn't be able to see a thing. So that's one analogy, one idea to think about. Here's another one to maybe kind of help instill the concept here of your aperture is, let's take a garden hose per se. Okay? And when we turn the water on in that garden hose, the water just flows straight out into the ground. Okay? And when it hits the ground, it's just a little puddle right there. It doesn't cover a lot of area. Okay? But as soon as we take our thumb and we cover that garden hose, the water then instantly sprays everywhere and it's covering a lot more area. All right? So a lot like your aperture. Okay? When we leave it wide open, we're going to get a little bit of detail. It's going to cover just a little bit of area in the picture. But as soon as we close down that aperture, just like we would on the garden hose, we're going to get a lot more detail. Now, how do we know in our camera settings, with our f-stop, which one's giving us more detail and which one's not? Okay, we can only go up or down on that scale, as I'm sure you've seen as you've played around with your f-stop. Okay, lower the number, the less detail. Higher the number, the more detail you're going to get. Okay, so that is the easiest way I think you could probably think about, is if I want more detail in my picture, I need a higher f-stop number. Okay, so now let's take a look at some pictures to see low f-stop, your shallow depth of field, and then we'll look at some deep depth of field with some landscapes. Now, the first one we're going to look at is a bride and groom. But in this picture, we have focused on the bouquet rather than the bride and groom. So with a shallow depth of field using a low f-stop number, in this shot it was f4, okay, we stepped back, we zoomed in on the flowers laying on the grass, and we got perfect detail on there, but we left the bride and the groom in their wedding venue in complete blur. Okay, this is nice, we can tell it's a wedding day, we can tell it was a beautiful day, but the focus of this picture is the flowers. We can see how beautiful those flowers were on that day. And the bride and groom loved this, especially the mom, because they spent a fortune on those flowers. Now, let's take a look at another picture. This is a family shot, okay? And with this many people in the shot, we needed to have a slightly higher f-stop number so that we can get everyone in focus. But we at the same time did not want the background to be at any sort of distraction. So using slightly higher, we bumped it up to like f6.3, f7. Zoomed in, we got the background blurry, but we're also able to get everyone else in focus. So you're going to see this a lot in portrait photography, this style of having a blurry background, and that's the way you do it. You could focus on the background, but your foreground will be blurry. So one way or another, depending on where you focus, you'll have a blurry background or blurry foreground. This is nice if you're trying to eliminate distraction and focus on one element of the photo. Now let's crank it up just a little bit. Let's talk just a little bit about the higher f-stops. For landscapes, this is going to be really important, okay? Because you want to see everything in detail. You don't want part of the photo in focus or not, okay? So with landscapes, we're looking at like an f-stop like f10, f12, somewhere in that range. You can go a lot higher, but sometimes I feel like you don't need to. You can if you want. If you feel it will make a difference, then by all means do it, okay? But let's take a look at this landscape shot. This is an aerial shot that I took from a park looking on towards a city skyline. I wanted the park, the trees, and then the city in the background in focus, because at this point I wanted you to be able to tell without a doubt what it is we're looking at. So using a high f-stop, we were able to get everything in focus, okay? Keep in mind, the higher the f-stop, probably the slower the shutter speed needs to be, because we're constricting the light that's passing through the lens. So we need to have a slower shutter speed to let enough light come through before we cut it off. Just a little bit of tip. Or you can increase your ISO after that and see if that doesn't help expose your photo. We're going to talk more about exposure and how your camera settings can play a part in that. Let's take a look at another picture here. This is a sunset over the Bay Area. And you can see that we got the road kind of winding through up into the hills there. And we have the sunset in the background. I wanted all of that in focus because all of that kind of leads you through, it kind of gives you a sense of actually being there. And I didn't want anyone to maybe guess or just wonder the detail of that scene, because the road itself isn't interesting enough to have that in focus with the rest in blur. And so having everything in focus was important to me to convey the shot. Now here's a little tip when it comes to using high f-stops. I'm sure you've seen those night shots or with street lights or some type of light source, okay, and they have that starburst effect. And how do you get that? Okay, now your f-stop is what's going to help you with that. The smaller your f-stop, okay, or the higher the number, is that starburst effect is going to happen because the light's passing through a small little hole on the lens, and once it gets through, it's just going to kind of do that starburst effect. But adversely, if you want to have that creamy light source kind of thing, that out of focus look, your small f-stop number is going to be the one to do that. Okay, that's just a little bit of a tip right there to kind of help you with that and the different effects you can see. Now, your photo challenge for this video is I want you to go out, I want you to practice with your f-stop. Okay, use Aperture Priority Mode, and we'll talk more about Aperture Priority Mode in a later video. But I want you to use that mode, set your f-stop accordingly from what you've learned, and let's take the same shot, the same picture, but do shallow depth of field and deep depth of field. Okay, it'll be a great way to practice and to see the same shot with less detail and more detail. You can do a portrait, you can do a landscape, you decide what it's going to be, but I want you to practice using the different f-stops and get an idea of at what point do you get really blurry backgrounds to somewhat blurry to kind of some detail to a lot of detail. Okay, you decide, but I want you to practice your depth of field photo shooting right now. Okay, if you have any questions, you run into trouble, you let me know and I'll help you out.